Well, in biblical literature, that brings us to number 31 this morning. I hope you're enjoying looking at these translations. I've really enjoyed looking at it because there's not one book available. If there was, we could probably just recommend it and just be on our way. But I know I use my notes. Once I have all these notes, you got to do study here and there, and even if there was a book available, there are always things from a charismatic or an overcomer's point of view that I want to say about them that you'd never find in any written material. But I use my notes as reference material. It's the easiest, quickest way to be able to look things up. So let's continue on our way. We're up to number 31, which is entitled The New Testament, an Expanded Translation. I don't think we're going to get any beyond this. Well, I'll say this, I don't plan to. So if we run out of material, then that'll just be the end for this morning. Because I have a lot to say about Wuest translation, and I have a lot next time to say about the Berkeley Bible. And I don't want to even try to get into Berkeley version whenever we're looking at Wuest. So the New Testament, an Expanded Translation, 1959. Now this is just the year after J.B. Phillips. J.B. Phillips was number 30. The New Testament in modern English, and the date was 1958. Now we are again dealing with a translation that is of personal interest to me. Back in 1975, at our Presbyterian church, during the summer of that year, the Holy Spirit was just wonderfully poured out on our Presbyterian congregation, and many of us, myself included, received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And we started meeting in homes with a young man. I don't even know what his age was, but I was only 16, so anybody over 20 is old to you when you're 16. I'm assuming he was probably in his mid-20s, which is young to me now, but it was old then. And he led the Bible study. And we would meet in different homes of young people in the body, or in our church. And we lived a long way off down in Mississippi. We had just built a new home, so we didn't get to meet down at our place but I think once. But we met in various homes, and one of the people's homes that we met in were the Amstons, and they had a large family of Mr. and Mrs., and I don't know how many sons and daughters, but 5 or 6 or 7, something like that. And they gave me my first copy of this Bible. So this is the original one. It's signed by them on the inside, all of the Amston family. So it has personal interest to me. The author is one Kenneth Wuest, W-U-E-S-T. And it generally goes by that name. It's generally, just like Phillips is called Phillips' Bible. No one ever calls it the New Testament in modern English. The New Testament, an expanded translation, is generally referred to as Wuest's translation. Kenneth S. Wuest, W-U-E-S-T. So I've had this copy. That means 13 years that I've had this copy bound in plastic, so it's kept well, published by Erdmans. Kenneth Wuest was for years and years professor of Greek at Moody Bible Institute. And whenever he did his translation, or whenever he completed the work, he was professor emeritus of Moody Bible Institute. Now, I don't know much about Wuest as far as covers, if it's hardback. I don't even know if it's still available today. I wouldn't know that. I'm assuming that it is, because it's been a very popular Bible, especially for young people. It's been a very popular Bible, especially for students, I would say. The back of mine has recommendations from Gordon Conwell, Southern Baptist Seminary, Nazarene Theological Seminary, Dr. Pentecost down at Dallas Seminary, William Barclay, who did his own Bible. We'll study Barclay's translation later, and the Parachurch Ministry InterVarsity. So that's a pretty large range of recommendation, especially when you throw Southern Baptist in Louisville, which is neo-Orthodox now. Most of the other things are conservative. Well, then you got Nazarene Seminary, but a lot of people have made use of this. It's not just some hippie's translation or something. I don't mean that when I say it's been used by a lot of young people or students, because it's recommended by the higher-ups. Wuest came out in 3 volumes. It was like a J.B. Phillips work. It didn't come out all at the same time. The Gospels were published in 1956. Then secondly, Acts through Ephesians. Acts through Ephesians came out in 1958. Bible students, what would that leave us with in the New Testament then? Philippians through Revelation came out in 1959. So I'm giving you the last date here, and then it's bound in one volume in 1959. Now, he gives his own name to the type of translation it is, and I don't think anyone else has followed this name, but he entitles it an expanded translation. Now, he claims it's not exactly a paraphrase. I have not been able to really tell the difference between a paraphrase and an expanded translation, but I think what he means is that an expanded one is more faithful to the original languages. It takes the various meanings of the original words, or perhaps the meaning that fits that context, and develops it like a flower in full bloom as much as possible, not adding in the author's thoughts in a paraphrase, but expanding what the Greek says. Well, of course, you're going to end up with a paraphrase sooner or later. But he calls it, he said, this is a special genre of Bible translating literature that he coins the term for himself, an expanded Bible, an expanded translation. So it's either known as the expanded New Testament or Wuest. Those are the two names it generally goes by, and Wuest by far predominates. Now, in our little test this morning that we had earlier this morning in biblical literature, one of the questions was, what was the most important thing about Charles B. Williams' translation? Do you remember that? What was the answer to that question? Okay, he tries as fully as possible to bring the complete nuance of the Greek verb over into English. Okay? Well, now, if you got to know that, because that's what I remember about Charles B. Williams, the New Testament in the Language of the People. You have to know that to know what I'm going to say about Wuest. Wuest attempts to do for every part of speech what Williams attempted to do for the verb. Okay, that's the best and easiest way to say it and to remember it. That Wuest does for every part of speech what Williams did for verbs. So there's not an intended relationship between Williams and Wuest. That's my own connection, because you have to find ways to make things easier to remember. You've just got, scads and scads of translations. You have to find some way to make them easy to remember. So Charles B. Williams, that was number 19, I think, that we did, 1937, the New Testament, the Language of the People, attempted to bring the nuances of the Greek verb into English, because the Greek verb is very rich, and we're kind of limited if we are reading the KJV. And so what Wuest does is he tries to do for every part of speech what Williams did for the verb. That is, he tries to bring nuances of the Greek, even in things such as pronouns, adverbs, adjectives, whatever, every part of speech. He tries to bring that over as fully as possible into the English, hence the name expanded, the expanded New Testament. Here's what Wuest has to say in his preface. This translation of the New Testament, unlike the standard translations, such as the Authorized Version of 1611 and the ASV of 1901, uses as many English words as are necessary to bring out the richness, force, and clarity of the Greek text. Williams did that just with the verb. Wuest is trying to do that for every aspect of speech, as you'll see in our study of Wuest this morning. The result is what I have called an expanded translation. It is intended as a companion to or commentary on the standard translations, and as such it complements them in several important respects. So Wuest, in other words, to interpret what he said there, does not intend for this to be the only or the major Bible that a person uses. He said this is to complement, to be a companion, or to be a commentary on whatever the normal translation is you use. He's assuming either the KJV or the ASV. He comes after the RSV and he doesn't assume you're using it. Well, nobody from Moody Bible Institute would use the RSV. So remember that. Now I'm going to have a lot of good things to say by the time we're through about Wuest, to the point that you may, if it's still in print, want to find a copy. It does extend into an expanded paraphrase, but he's from Moody Bible Institute. That's a very, very, very traditionally conservative, premillennial and everything type of school in Chicago. And so I don't think you've got to be afraid of the theology behind this man, Kenneth Wuest. And I have used it on occasions because it does bring out more than the NIV could, because that's a translation. This is a paraphrase. It's like a J.B. Phillips. This is a paraphrase. It's an expanded translation. But it brings out things that you would not know were there unless you knew the original languages or studied the Greek text. So let me go point by point. I've got about 9 or 10 things I want to say, and this will constitute the heart of our study of Wuest this morning. Number 1, and you're going to have your KJV available, please, because I want you to turn to these passages and listen as I read Wuest. You compare the KJV, and you'll see what I mean. That it is expanded, it's very rich and very full, and I've used it on occasion. Not really to, understand, maybe better what's being said, but for devotional purposes, because it gives you more things to meditate on than what you'll find in a bare word-for-word literal translation, which is what the KJV is. Number 1, I would say that it follows the Greek order of words as closely as possible in the English translation. Now that can be awkward sometimes. That can be awkward sometimes, because English is a language that's very dependent upon word order. Greek is not dependent upon the word order. It's a language of decline. You're declining everything. And so you can put your words, this isn't 100% of the time true, but you can put your words in various places that wouldn't fit in English, and the case ending will let you know what's going on. But in other words, if we wanted to say, Mary kicked the ball to John, it makes a lot of difference where the words in that sentence are if we're wanting to get that meaning across, that Mary kicked the ball to John. We can't say the ball kicked John to Mary. Now you could say that in Greek, because the case endings would tell you where these words go, what part of speech they are performing, but you can't do that in English. So here are some examples. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 9. And right away, right off the bat, in our first example, not only are we going to see Greek order of words, he attempts to bring them over into English, but you're going to see how expanded it is. Now the KJV says something like this: all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. Now you watch, and here's what he has in his translation. These things to you, all of them, I will give, if, having fallen down upon your knees, and having touched the ground with your forehead, in an expression of profound reverence, you would prostrate yourself in worship before me. That's why my New Testament of Wuest is about the same size as my whole Bible, KJV. He took about 3 or 4 times the material to say what is said in the KJV. Now watch that again. These things to you, this is the Greek order of the words, and sometimes Greek order is intended to emphasize something. These things to you, all of them, I will give, if, and just comma, 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 comma in Wuest here. These things, comma, to you, comma, all of them, comma, I will give, comma, if, comma, having fallen down upon your knees, and having touched the ground with your forehead, in an expression of profound reverence, comma, you would prostrate yourself in worship before me. All right, another example, Matthew 16:23. Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Get thee behind me, Satan." Wuest, Matthew 16:33. Be gone under my authority, and keep on going. Now there's the verb he's trying to bring out. Be gone under my authority and keep on going behind me, out of my sight, Satan. This is what he has to say in his preface. Let's see, top of page 8. He said that the translation here offered will undoubtedly often jar the reader who is used to the smoothness of the standard translations. But it is hoped that thus the reader's attention will be forcibly drawn to what he is reading. Mine certainly is when I see complicated, complex, compound sentences like these. Secondly, about Wuest. In his opinion, he attempts to bring out the full philological and theological meanings of the Greek. First one was a concentration on word order. But he, in his opinion, attempts to bring out the full philological and theological meanings of the Greek. A couple of examples, Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is rather long. Romans 12:2. Stop assuming an outward expression that does not come from within yourself. Be not conformed to this world. Stop assuming an outward expression that does not come from within yourself and is not representative of what you are in your inner nature, but is put on from the outside and patterned after this age. Now all that is be not conformed to this world. That whole 3-sentence segment there is just be not conformed to this world. Stop assuming an outward expression that does not come from within yourself and is not representative of what you are in your inner nature, but is put on from the outside and patterned after this age. But change your outward expression to one that comes from within yourself and is representative of what you are in your inner nature. I think that's it's expanded to be sure, but I think that's a real beautiful way of saying it. And then if you'll turn over to Ephesians 3:17, we're going to have a lot of verses we have to look at. Ephesians 3:17. The KJV has that Christ may dwell in your hearts. Well, that's rather short, brief, understandable, that Christ may dwell in your hearts. He has, in order that Christ may finally settle down and feel completely at home in your hearts. That's what dwell means. I mean, dwell, you don't sit and think, what does dwell mean? Dwell doesn't mean like a temporary situation. When you finally dwell in your home, you finally settle down, get everything arranged, all the pictures hung and the furniture arranged, and you settle down and feel comfortable in your home. Well, that's what he's saying here. You won't get that in any translation because it takes too many words. You have to have a paraphrase or an expanded translation. In order that Christ may finally settle down and feel completely at home in your hearts. That's a beautiful translation there. So I'm going to have a lot of positive things to say about Wuest by the time we're through. Number 3, distinctions between Greek, quote, synonyms, unquote, are brought out. Distinctions between synonyms are brought out. Now, let's start over in Galatians. Now, in our Wednesday night study in spirituality, I knew that we were going to be mentioning something there this past Wednesday night because Galatians has, I can think of 2 immediate occasions, first chapter and last chapter. We were in chapter 6, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. And so I just assumed that Wuest would somehow deal with these. He doesn't deal with these, and I don't know exactly why. But what I'm talking about in Galatians 6 would be verse 2 and verse 5. That, I remember, was always a problem to me. I don't know about you, but as I read my Bible, I would read in verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then I'd be reading along, and I couldn't even get past verse 5, and the apostle now is saying, every man shall bear his own burden. Well, that's a contradiction right away. 2 says bear someone else's burden. Everyone bears someone else's. And we get to verse 5, every man is supposed to bear his own burden. Well, you got two different Greek words here. Burden, it's translated burden by the KJV both times. But it shouldn't be, because it does produce a contradiction. And there's a slightly different meaning to the term up in verse 5. It's better translated load. You say, well, it's the same as burden. That's a synonym. Well, yeah, it is a synonym. But we've got to come up with some different word between verses 2 and 5, since if we don't, we'd have a contradiction, and since, secondly, and more importantly, the Greek has two different words here. So what the difference would be meaning-wise is beyond biblical lit this morning. We'd look at that some other time. But just to have that corrected, and I checked Wuest, and Wuest gives burden in both places. I don't know why he does, because it's confusing. Bear ye one another's burdens, and then verse 5, every man shall bear his own burden. But he does deal with the one which is much more famous back in chapter 1 of the book of Galatians. I want to show you something about this word. You probably just knew from, well, just knowing. As you read, you kind of know things. You don't know that you know them until someone points it out to you. Oh, yeah, I knew that. I didn't know that it was something that was supposed to be known. I just assumed that it was that way. Well, look at Galatians 1, verses 6 and 7. Now, Paul, after his little brief 5-verse introduction, is actually starting into his writing. And he says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you to the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Well, then immediately what Paul thinks in his mind, he goes on to qualify it in verse 7, is there's no such thing as another gospel. There's only one gospel. There's no such thing as another one. So he knows he's got to come back in verse 7 and explain himself, because they could twist the meaning. Remember, they're going off into Judaism here, and then they could quote Galatians 1:6 back to Paul. After all, Paul, you said, you agreed with Judaism, you said it was the gospel. It's just another form. But the gospel is the gospel, however, in whatever form it comes. So Paul said, I marvel that you've been led, or you've deserted the faith of Christ, and you've gone into another gospel. And then watch verse 7, which is not another. But there be some that trouble you that would pervert the gospel of Christ. Okay, so you've got, in other words, two different appearances of the word another. Well, you got two different Greek words here. Now, you don't have to have different English words here, but you do have to understand the flow of the argument, or it's confusing when Paul just admitted with his own pen the fact that you've gone to another gospel. And then he comes right back and says, no, you haven't gone to another gospel, because there is no other gospel. Well, we would say, Paul, make up your mind. Did they go to another one, or didn't they go to another one? Well, the first Greek word means another of a different kind. It means another, but it means another of a different kind. The second word, and he deals with this, Wuest, he has this correct here. The second another, which is in verse 7, is another of the same kind. Two different Greek words. They can both be translated another. But the first means another of a different kind, and another of the same kind. All right, so let me give you an example. We've done this. We all do it in our own speech, in our own religious speech. We come back and qualify ourselves, and we just assume that people understand what we mean, and that we're not speaking a contradiction. But we could say something like this, that we know a person, there's a Roman Catholic church in the area, okay? And someone has come out of that Roman Catholic church, saved, baptized in the Spirit, come into this church and stayed for a few years. Then got their feelings hurt, they were offended, and they left this church and went back to that Roman Catholic church. So what could we say? Well, we could say that, well, that person has left and gone to another church. But then we come back and say, they haven't really gone to another church, because the Roman Catholic Church is no church. If we're using it in a specific sense, a biblical sense, it's a false cult. Right. It's not the church of Jesus Christ. Amen. And yet we could use the term church to begin with to explain what we mean. Okay, they've gone to another faith. Well, there is no faith, but the one and only faith in Jesus Christ. So we could say they've gone to another faith, but then again, they haven't. So we're talking about different kinds of churches or different kinds of faith. So here's what Paul is saying. Verse 6, I marvel that you've gone to another gospel of a different kind than the one you were brought up with, which is not another of the same kind. In other words, he's saying, I'm not allowing you to say that there are two different roads to the same point of truth here. Your other gospel is not another of the same kind, that is, of the kind we're talking about, the gospel of Jesus Christ. So you generally have to find a commentary that will point out the difference here in Galatians 1, verses 6 and 7. But again, in my own reading in the years past, I know that I came across this passage because I tried to read carefully when I would read, and I would say, I wonder what he means there. I mean, I kind of thought that he meant what I just said, but, why not use a different word or something? And lo and behold, he did use a different word. I just didn't know it. It's in the Greek. It's not in the English here, though. So with that, I would understand it better, that you've gone to another gospel of a different kind. Then he says in verse 7, which is not another branch of Christianity. There aren't branches. There's only one way. It's not another branch. But there be some that would take the gospel and twist it and pervert it. And that's exactly what he goes on to say in verse 7. So he's trying to say there's not a way to God called Christianity and a way to God called Judaism, and you can pick either way. One is a gospel, the other is another of the same kind, but there's only one way, and it's Christianity. And if anyone is dabbling with Christianity, but they're not going the whole way, they have another gospel of a different kind because they've taken the truth and twisted it and perverted it. And notice that's exactly what he goes on to say in verse 7. He explains himself so that they couldn't quote to him verse 6, well, we're in the good news. We have the gospel. You said we've chosen another gospel, but at least it's the gospel. Well, his emphasis is on the word another, not on gospel. Gospel, by the way, stays the same in verse 6, implied in the first part of verse 7, which is not another gospel, in italics, implied, and then he uses it in the end of verse 7 and would pervert the gospel of Christ. That remains the same. It's the word another that changes here. So, what are we on here in Wuest? Distinctions between Greek synonyms are brought out. And he brings this out in this translation essentially the way I'm saying right now. Then let me give you the most famous reference for sure in all the New Testament, whether you're dealing with Wuest or something else, and ink has been spilled over this, and scholars still are, conservative ones are divided right down the middle as to whether there is any difference in meaning or not, and that is in John 21, 15 to 19. Remember when Jesus appears to Peter and says, Simon Peter, lovest thou me more than these? Yea, Lord, you know that I love thee. Jesus said, feed my sheep. The second time, Simon Peter, lovest thou me? Yea, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep. The third time, Simon Peter, lovest thou me? Peter's grieved that it's the third time. You know, Lord, that I love you. All right, you remember that little episode? Amen. John 21, verses 15 through 19. Let me read it in the KJV first. Well, I probably essentially just quoted it to you then. So when they had dined, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? And you'll see how Wuest translates or how he interprets these. These what? There are about three different options. Do you love me more than you love your old occupation? This is after death, burial, resurrection, and some post-resurrection experiences, and Peter's back out there fishing again. It's the last day, the end of the age. Peter, what are you doing? Fishing again. I've called you to be fishers of men. Do you love me and the calling to my work and ministry more than these fish, these boats and nets? That's one interpretation. Another, do you love me more than you love your fellow men, disciples here? These guys love to spend a lot of time together fishing. A third interpretation, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? See how ambiguous that is? Lovest thou me more than these? Well, so there are the three best-known interpretations. I'll let you work through them and see which one is right. He saith, and that's not our point this morning. Our point is the term love. He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Well, in the first time, when Jesus used the term love, it's the agapao term. You probably heard this in sermon. It's a well-known sermon to deal with. I've heard this many different times. Whenever Peter responds, Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo. he uses a different term for love. And so the average pastor, a person who teaches on this, right away says, now agapao, that's a strong term for love. That's a self-sacrificial love, and phileo means brotherly love. Well, there's only a little bit of truth to that. Because if you will remember our study, we did a rather extensive study in the Greek terms for love in Christian ethics. And what we saw was that in the New Testament, yes, agapao is singled out as the important of the available love terms like storge and eros and phileo and agapao, those four Greek terms. C.S. Lewis has a book entitled The Four Loves, and he means those four words right there. And although that's true, we saw that the terms are used synonymously of one another. You'll have in one place an agapao term, like in Matthew's Gospel. Whenever the exact same account is being given over in Mark or Luke or John or whatever, you have a phileo term. And more importantly than that, you have several occasions where it says, the Father loveth the Son, and guess what the term is? Not agape, not the agapao term. It's that brotherly love, that phileo term. So that tends to at least dilute, if not destroy, the notion that one of these words, agapao, is all the time and only the extreme form of self-sacrificial love. You often hear it like this, the God kind of love. And phileo is just brotherly, natural, earthly, from one man to another love. Well, that cannot be true, because as a matter of fact, the gospel writer John uses the term phileo, which we would think, if we've heard a lot of popular sermons on love in the New Testament, we would think as a brotherly term, uses it in relationships in the Godhead, that the Father phileo the Son. Brotherly love, does that fit? Well, there must be a stronger meaning on occasions to the term phileo. And so a whole lot of modern commentators, now that they've done a lot of exhaustive study, and a lot of study has been done on those two terms in Greek literature, they've come to the conclusion that the two terms are nothing but synonyms, that they mean exactly the same thing. So if that is true, then we're going to have to approach John 21:15-19 from another angle than the popular angle, where Jesus is asking for complete devotion on Peter's behalf, and Peter's only willing to render halfway. That's the typical, especially in earlier days, interpretation of this passage. But if the terms are synonyms, then we could just swap them around. Jesus could have used the phileo, and Peter could have used the agapao, and it wouldn't change the meaning at all. I happen not to believe the modern day interpretation. I think there's a difference in these words, and I say that with all the study I've done on those love terms, which is on cassette tape. I fully recognize what I've just taken a few moments to explain, that the terms are used synonymously in the New Testament, and that agapao isn't necessarily the supreme form of love, because sometimes, as I say, phileo is used with regard to relations in the Godhead, in the Trinity. But whenever you have a case where the words seem to me to be obviously set against one another, Jesus asking, do you love me, agapao, and then Peter responding, phileo, Jesus asking the second time, agapao, Peter responding, phileo, Jesus asking the third time, phileo, Peter responding, yes, phileo. I think I see a difference there. That's the old interpretation, although even a lot of conservatives don't buy that today. He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. You see, it doesn't help us in English because all the terms are love. But as we're going to see, Wuest is going to give us meaning here. Let's go back to that first love and say, do you love me supremely? And then Peter says, yes, I have a brotherly feeling towards you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. He saith unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you have a supreme love for me? He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, you know that I have a brotherly affection for you. He saith unto him, feed my sheep. He saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you have a brotherly, warm affection for me? Peter was grieved because he had said unto him the third time, do you have a brotherly affection for me? And that's one of the things that throws some people today. He saith unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things, thou knowest that I have a brotherly affection for thee. Jesus saith unto him, feed my sheep. All right, let's see what Wuest does. Do you understand what I'm saying there? You've heard sermons on that before? Some of you have. A lot of you are shaking your head. All right. I know I have. 15. Then when they had breakfasted, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, do you have a love for me called out of your heart by my preciousness to you? A devotional love that impels you to sacrifice yourself for me? Now all of that is the word love in the KJV. Do you have a love for me called out of your heart by my preciousness to you? A devotional love that impels you to sacrifice yourself for me. Do you consider me more precious and thus love me more than these, in brackets, fish? So that is Wuest's interpretation of that passage, that Jesus is speaking of his return to the fishing ministry or industry. He says to him, yes, Lord, as for you, you know positively that I have an emotional fondness for you. That's not what Jesus asked. Do you have an emotional fondness for me? He says to him, be feeding my little lambs. He says to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonas, do you have a devotional love for me called out of your heart by my preciousness to you, a love that impels you to sacrifice yourself for me? He says to him, yes, Lord, as for you, you know positively that I have a friendly feeling for you. He says to him, be shepherding my sheep. He says to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you have a friendly feeling? Now, you see, Jesus drops his term and uses Peter's term. Do you have a friendly feeling and affection for me? And Peter was grieved that he said to him the third time, do you have a friendly feeling and affection for me? And he said to him, Lord, as for you, all things you know positively. You know from experience that I have a friendly feeling and affection for you. And Jesus says to him, be feeding my sheep. So what I'm saying is Wuest does something that the KJV and most translations don't do for us. He tries to show us that, at least in his opinion, a difference of meaning is intended in the selection of these two terms. You have a question?
Would you say that there's a contrast between fish and the feeding of sheep, of being fishers and fishers?
Well, that depends on whether or not you take the reference there, these, to these, as referring to fishing industry. If you don't, and you certainly don't have to, then there wouldn't be a contrast. You would have another meaning. Instead of do you love me more than this fishing industry that you've gone back into, do you love me more than these other disciples here love me? Because if you go on and read this chapter, remember we have a problem with Peter and John's relationship to Jesus as compared and contrasted with each other. So that's one thing that leads people to believe the other view here. Do you love me more than the other disciples? Because Jesus tells him in verse 18, tells Peter what his future life is going to hold for him. And so look what Peter says in 21. Peter, seeing him, that is John, saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? In other words, Peter's concerned about this man. So Jesus may have seen something latent in him. He's too concerned about other people, God's calling on them and their relationship to him, and not concerned enough about his own. So it would depend on how you interpret that. So Galatians 1, 6, and 7, John 21, verses 15 to 19, are a big help, I think, in showing a difference where a difference should be shown in what for some people are Greek synonyms. All right, number 4. The force of the negative may in Greek. On the E. The force of the negative may is brought out. Now there are different ways of saying no in Greek, or there are different, what we call negatives, enclitic negatives. There are different types, different ways of saying no. One way of saying no is including this negative word, may, in the question, so that the question itself would then imply the answer, no. Now, if that's confusing, let me show you that by example. John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and verse 67. Now this is very important, and I'll show you how we do it in English, and you'll, I'm sure, understand it better then. But the Greek, if it wants to ask a question with the understanding answer being in the negative no, then it uses this word may, M-E. And this will tell you something that you wouldn't know otherwise here in this passage. Now, Jesus has given a strong teaching on election and divine sovereignty, and from that teaching, verse 66, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. Then said Jesus unto the 12, Will ye also go away? Well, that's not exactly what he said, because that leaves it open for them to say, yes, we will, or no, we won't. We will or we won't. Yes or no. That phrasing of it tends to leave it open. The Greek doesn't say that. The Greek says, you will not go away, will you? That's how we do it in English. We already state the answer, our assumption, you won't do this, will you? With the assumption, the answer will be, no, I won't. If we just say, are you going to the store, we don't know if the answer will be yes or no. If we say, you aren't going to the store, are you? It's kind of implied that the answer will be no. Okay, so Jesus isn't in doubt here over the destiny of his apostles, those that are left. He's not just saying, well, are you guys going to leave? He's saying, you're not going to leave, are you? It's a question, to be sure. It's a question. You are not going to leave, are you? But it has the implied negative for a response. So here's what Wuest has in John 6:67. As for you, you are not desiring to go away, are you? Now that's really the way it should be, since the Greek and it doesn't have to use this word may. It's an implied negative, and it needs to be expressed somehow in the sentence. And Wuest has done a good job. Are you following me there? Mm-hmm. As for you, you are not desiring to go away, are you? Another example is John 3:4. And there are just, scores of these in the New Testament. John 3:4. Second question here by Nicodemus. How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Well, obviously not. Nicodemus isn't saying that. He knows that can't be true. So if we just translate it like it is in the KJV, you end up with something that's a little bit ridiculous. And if you don't watch out, you'll have little lay people preaching a message on this and almost make it as though Nicodemus assumed that was really possible. Nicodemus is no fool, not that type of fool anyway. Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? If you're a grown man, well, he even says what? Old in verse 4. An old man, you got to shrink back, you got to degrow, ungrow for 40 years and go back down to a little small thing and go back inside your mother and start all. Nicodemus is no fool. That's not what he's saying. Here's what Wuest has. How is a man able to be born, being an old man? He is not able a second time to enter the womb of his mother and be born, is he? Well, of course not. That's the implied no. He wants an answer. He wants an explanation here. But he's never assuming that Jesus would say, yes, that's what you've got to do. You've got to shrink back to 7 pounds, 2 ounces and go back inside your mother. He is not able. See, there's the may. It's a negative. He is not able. He is not able a second time to enter the womb of his mother and be born, is he? Because he knows Jesus will say, well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. So Nicodemus is not asking for some gynecological information here. He's asking for some spiritual help. Some spiritual help. This can't be true. So since this can't be true, what is the answer? What do you mean being born again? See, he's already ruling that out. A man can't go back into his mother's womb. So since that isn't true, is it? Well, no, Jesus would say. Then what is true? So that really helps. That really helps in the New Testament when you find that. Then number 5 with Wuest. Verb tenses are carried over fully. Verb tenses are carried over fully. Example, Matthew 4:4 with the perfect tense. I think all we have in the KJV is the little phrase, "It is written." It is written. Matthew 4:4, Jesus said, "It's written, man shall not live by bread alone." Well, here's what we says in trying to bring out the full meaning of the perfect tense, which is the tense used here in this verb, "it is written." It has been written and is at present on record. That's his translation. It has been written and is at present on record. To let us know that he's speaking of an action completed in the past time. But in this context, it has permanent results down to this day. Not just, well, it's written, like it has been written and that's old and done away with. It has been written and it's still written today. Perfect tense. All right, then another example, and I want you to see this one over in Philippians 3, verses 12 to 15. Now here's another one of those cases, similar to the ones in Galatians. Galatians 6 and Galatians 1. However, in the Galatians account, we were dealing with synonyms. Here we're not dealing with synonyms, we're dealing with verb tenses. Philippians 3:12 through 15. Now watch what Paul says in 12. He says, "Not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect." So Paul's disclaiming having reached some state of perfection. And I remember this years ago. I'm telling you the truth. I really remember coming across these things. And I guess they were so easy. I'm not claiming any great thing here because you don't have to leave the chapter. All you got to do is read a few more verses and you come across the same word in a different way. Now look at verse 15. Now Paul just said, "I'm not perfect." The great apostle said, "I'm not perfect." Then he says in verse 15, let us therefore as many as be perfect." He includes himself when he just says that he wasn't perfect. Now he says, "Let those of us who are perfect be thus minded." Okay, here's how Wuest explains that. Now I've got his own explanation here in the preface. In Philippians 3:12, Paul says that he is not yet perfect, namely spiritually mature. In 3:15, he includes himself with those who are perfect, as we've just seen. So how do we explain that? Well, the term perfect is the same in both. We're not dealing with another Greek word here that would change the meaning, but we are dealing with different tenses of the verbs in the Greek. The explanation of this apparent contradiction is brought out clearly in the expanded translation as follows. In Philippians 3:12, Paul uses the perfect tense. He denies the fact that he has been brought to the place of absolute spiritual maturity by the Holy Spirit, a place where there is no more possibility of growth and where it is impossible to sin. Paul is saying, I'm not at that point. In 3:15, Paul uses the verb of being as a noun. Here he speaks of relative spiritual maturity where there is room for growth in the Christian life. Therefore, his translation is like this: "Not that I," verse 12, "have now already been brought to that place of absolute spiritual maturity beyond which there is no progress." Verse 15. "As many, therefore, as are spiritually mature," in brackets, in a relative sense, in the brackets, and so forth. Well, you probably could have gotten that anyway. You would know somehow the words are being used differently. They're being used with different meanings here. When Paul disclaims perfection in 12 and then claims it in 15. And I think that Wuest is right. Paul is saying, I haven't reached that place beyond which there is no growth and in which it's not impossible for me to sin. He's saying, I have not reached that place. That place cannot be reached in this life. But then there are many other scriptures where the Bible tells us to be perfect. To be perfect. And here is one of them in verse 15. "Let us therefore as many as be perfect be thus minded." Well, he means in a relative sense. To the best of your ability, walking in the light that you have, and so forth. There's still room for growth, and there are still occasions for offense and sin. But you are a spiritually mature individual. All right, then another type that I would put here under number 5, verb tenses, that was dealing with the perfect tense. Let's deal with the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense in John 3:23. John 3:23. Now the KJV has this. They came, speaking of the people from Jerusalem, and were baptized, coming to be baptized of John in water. Well, a short, brief sentence, they came and were baptized. Well, the imperfect is used in the Greek, and here is how Wuest brings it out in his expanded translation. They kept on coming in a steady procession and were being baptized. See, they came and were baptized sounds like a once-for-all event, that X number of people came out and got baptized and left. That's not really what the Greek is saying. They kept on coming in a steady procession and were being baptized. I mean, there were lots of people over an extended period of time. The KJV might not give you that impression. It might leave you with, well, on Tuesday morning, X number of people came down from Jerusalem and were baptized and then went back home, and that was the end of it. So he wants to clarify that. The sixth place, number 6. See, I have a lot to say about Wuest. I'm glad I didn't naively think we'd get to Berkeley when I looked more carefully at Wuest's notes here. Pronouns are translated. Pronouns. Now, we have dealt with this once earlier, by the way, with another translation, but I'll just mention it here again briefly. Say, well, what's the big business about pronouns? We translate them too. Well, as I've said before, the Greek doesn't have to use pronouns because the person is in the verb. You know whether it's I or you or he, she, it doing it, we, you plural, or they doing it from the ending of the verb. We have to say, if we're going to use the word went, we don't know who did the wenting. We don't have any idea. Right in our verb, we have to say I or you or he or they. The Greek doesn't have to do that. It can contain all of that right here in the verb. So, whenever you've got the person, let's say that this is second person singular, so it's you went. It's what's in the verb. No, let's do something differently, since I want to use a different example here in John 10:11 anyway. Let's say I. That's already in the verb. So what we have, if we translate that in English, that verb would say I went. That's all in the verb. But also, they use a pronoun. And of course, what pronoun is it? I. And that's literally what you have in Greek. Because you've already got the person in the verb. Who's doing the wenting? Who's going? It's I who went. Well, why do you use a pronoun then? You already have it. It's in your verb. It's in the verb ending. I went. So, generally, whenever a pronoun is used, it is for emphasis or for contrast. You don't get it in most of your English translations. You do get it in something like Wuest. For example, what I say, John 10:11. John 10:11. I am the good shepherd. Which in Greek is, well, let me do something else here first of all. I am the good shepherd. Okay, in the Greek, here's your verb. You're going to have, who's the good shepherd? They are the good shepherd. We are the good shepherds. I am the good shepherd. You're going to have in your verb, which is your verb, a me. Now, in Greek, we don't only have that, knowing who is the good shepherd, we have the pronoun ego. And most of the time, it's rather characteristic with the gospel writer John, because John is based around the 7 so-called I am sayings. And it's finally all realized at the end of chapter 8 where he doesn't have anything after, and he just says, before Abraham was, ego eimi. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I am. But I am the bread of life. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, the life. I am the resurrection and the life. All of those are the so-called ego eimi statements of John, which is just a double way of saying I am. You've already got the I in the verb am. I am. Ho poime, ho kalos, the good shepherd. So you're going to find this throughout John's Gospel, which in English, if you don't write this, is ego. We get our word ego, ego, E-I-M-I, ego eimi. And so, what does he have here? I alone am the good shepherd. Now the Greek doesn't have the word alone, but it's using a double person here. I as a pronoun and I in the verb ending. So what's being said here? You've got to find some way to bring all of that out. And Wuest chooses to do that with the word alone. I alone am the good shepherd. And he does this, I assume, with other things. I alone am the way, the truth, the life. Because you already have your eimi, which is your verb, first person singular. And you add your first person singular pronoun to that, ego. Questions on that? If you don't understand it now, stop me and ask me. I'm assuming that you're following me. We've dealt with this once before. Now, ego eimi can be translated like other ways. I think that's what is used in the Greek whenever there's a storm at sea and they're frightened and they see Jesus and they suppose that he's a spirit and they're afraid. And what does he say? Be not afraid, it is I. Ego eimi. Same thing there. It is I. Be not afraid, ego eimi. It is I. All right, 1 Corinthians 11:23. Here's the one that we have used earlier. 1 Corinthians 11:23. Now, if I can just get you to understand this and realize this and remember this, then I won't have to go into all this explanation. If we're just teaching somewhere, and I tell you, now the verb already has a person, and a personal pronoun is also used. Then if you can remember, this is something you just got to memorize. Then you know what I'm intending to imply by that is that something significant is to be seen here. The personal pronoun is superfluous. It's extra. It's added. There must be a reason for it being added. He could have just said, eimi, the good shepherd. What is that? How does that translate? I am the good shepherd. Eimi, the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. But he says, ego eimi, ho poime ho kalos. I am the good shepherd. So something else must be intended. I think this passage in 1 Corinthians 11:23 is talking about Paul receiving from the Lord these instructions about communion. For I have received. For I have received. I think we discussed this in Young's literal translation. For I have received. Have received has the first person. It's in the first person. We know who received it, Paul, I. Well, why do he adds ego as well? First person singular pronoun. First person singular personal pronoun, ego. Ego have received. I have received. I myself. I have received. I didn't get this from someone else. I received this. He's trying to emphasize. And 1 John 2 and verse 2. 1 John 2 and verse 2. There's your expiation, propitiation text. Produces that problem in the RSV. He is the propitiation for our sins. Well, again, is already has the person in it, second person singular, he is, but yet we also have a personal pronoun. He is. And so here is what Wuest gives us. He himself is a propitiation for our sins. He himself is a propitiation for our sins. Praise the Lord. I'm not even going to get through Wuest this morning. I gave you 6. That was 6, right? All right, let me skip and give you my number 8 because it's briefer than my number 7. We'll stop with this, but you can count it as your number 7, I guess. It's my number 8. The ifs, I-F-S, the ifs are taken care of. See, what we try to do with biblical literature is not only teach you something about a translation, but use that to get 2 birds with 1 stone. Teach you some other things as well. Over to Matthew chapter 4 and verse 3. That's why it takes us a long time. We have so much to say. Matthew 4, verse 3, and the same is in verse 5, and I think it's down in verse 9 as well. When the devil comes to tempt Jesus, what he says there is, if thou be the Son of God. I'm going to have to look Wuest up. I can't recall how he deals with it. If thou be the Son of God. Oh, yeah. I thought that's what he said. Well, now, what that would imply to us in English is doubt. That he's calling in question Jesus' sonship. And that's not true. That's not right. You know, if you are the Son of God, putting an if in his mind, getting him to think about it and doubt the fact that he is a son, that he is the Son of God. Okay, that's the typical way that it's interpreted, that the if implies doubt. That's not true at all. There's a particular Greek construction here in this passage, verses 3, 6, and 9, where doubt is not being suggested. Rather, the devil is asking Christ to reflect on the meaning of his sonship. There's no way the devil could ever tempt Jesus to doubt his sonship. That's impossible. And you know, that's not even what the series of temptations are about here. Reflect on the meaning. What does it mean to be the Son of God? Does it mean that you have the power, the authority, to turn stones into bread, to leap from the pinnacle of the temple and the angels will catch you up? Isn't that included within the role of sonship and of being the Son of God? The devil knows that he's the Son of God. He knows that Jesus knows that he's the Son of God. He knows there's no way you can sow doubt in his mind over that. Get him to reflect on the meaning of sonship. Is this what sonship entails? Using your powers indiscriminately down here on the earth.